Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in with us again. And we've been getting some feedback from the past few videos that we've done, and I'm glad you're enjoying them, and I'm glad you're being able to engage. And this week, we're going to talk a little bit about the women of the early church, and particularly just immediately after the time of Jesus and Pentecost. So, I want to first of all acknowledge that we are two white dudes talking about the women of the church. So, we do acknowledge that it would be awesome to have a female voice speak into this. We weren't able to orchestrate that with all the social distance restrictions that we have going on just now.
You're just going to get us,
Just us.
for
just
which we
us.
apologize, but we hope it's a stimulating conversation anyway.
Yeah, Drew and I are actually swapping sides every week if you haven't noticed that, just to try and keep things fresh, keep things engaged. So I just wanted to start a little bit. I think if you asked, like, just polled a random person on like in your kind of your church on the pew of can you name some of the women who are in the New Testament? And I think you would hear Mary.
Yep.
You would hear the other Mary, and you probably hear the other Mary.
And the other Mary.
But I think
that's right.
Beyond that, Drew, where do you think the responsibility lies as preachers, as pastors, in telling the story of the women of the New Testament? Well, so often we're so quick to go to the male disciples. And they're named, but they're in every story when there was a miracle, it was like Jesus and the disciples were named, and others.
Yeah.
Who would have been women, who would have been children.
Yeah.
And they may have been up to 120 or so.
Yeah.
So I think we often think of there's 12 dudes following Jesus around for a little bit, with some of like his relatives and a couple of the Marys.
Yeah.
But it's such like a bigger picture. Can you just share a little bit about what do you think is lost when we don't recognize the role of women in Jesus' life and immediately afterwards? And what do you think, what can we learn from them if we can really sit down and think about the role they played in the Jesus journey while he was on earth and immediately afterwards?
Yeah, and I think the first way to answer that question is by doing what you just said, which is kind of recognizing that there were a whole lot of other women who are following Jesus from day one, essentially, that we kind of sometimes lose maybe in the background of stories, or we pass over their stories because there's not as much time devoted to them in the Synoptic Gospels. Those kinds of things maybe cause us to just sort of let them fade into the background, whereas we see Jesus and the male disciples often in the foreground more. I mean, obviously Jesus in the foreground, but the male disciples in the foreground of our stories more. So I think part of it is just recognizing that they were present and that they play a pivotal role in several ways in the New Testament. I think a second way that we can do this, or a sort of a subset of that, is by looking particularly at Luke's gospel. So if we look closely at Luke's gospel, one of the distinctives of the way Luke tells Jesus' story is in a way that highlights two groups of people: one, the poor, and secondly, women. So there are more stories about women. The stories about women receive more attention in Luke's gospel than in any of the other three gospels. And we have a couple or three stories in Luke's gospel about women that we don't have in any of the other gospels. So it's a real distinctive of Luke's gospel in particular to elevate these two groups that are marginalized in Palestinian society at this time, to really show how Jesus' ministry attends to them, that the bringing of the nearness of the kingdom of God, as Jesus preaches, is for all people, particularly for men and women, particularly for the rich and the poor. And Luke really elevates the categories of people who are poor and women so that they're more prominent in his telling of Jesus' story.
So biblical scholars would likely say that Theophilus, who Luke Acts was addressed to, was a wealthy Roman benefactor who was curious about Christianity, and he sort of bankrolled Luke to do his dissertation on how the church got where it was.
Yeah.
What do you think would be significant, in particularly the Greco-Roman culture that Theophilus would have come from, about Luke really like shining the light on the role of women in the starts of the early church?
Yeah, I mean, so there are a couple of things going on in the sort of social context of the Greco-Roman Empire at the time that Luke is writing, and even in the time that Jesus lived. So Luke's writing after Jesus lived, but even in the time of Jesus, there are some shifts in society that are going on. This whole benefactor relationship was well established in the Greco-Roman Empire by this time, and a benefactor was someone who was essentially funding but also like supporting various endeavors. It might have been like an itinerant teaching something or other. It could be a ministry, like in one sort of educational thing or whatever. Or it could be something else entirely. It could be like an industry of some sort. You might have a benefactor who is essentially your lead investor in your business, and so you were running your business based off of the funds and investment of one person or one family. So this sort of relationship was well established, and most scholars think that that's something of what's going on here between Luke, the gospel writer, and Theophilus, whom Luke is writing to. That Theophilus is the one who funded Luke to actually get the materials to write down the gospel, but also to kind of travel around, maybe interview people. Luke seems to indicate that he's interviewed people and gathered all of these stories and those kinds of things. So that sort of relationship is well established. What's new in the time of Jesus, and particularly in the time that Luke is writing, is that some wealthy women had begun to rise to the status of benefactor. Now, these might have been wealthy women who were widows. So they had a wealthy family, perhaps a wealthy husband who had passed away. But it also might have been sort of daughters of families who had, there were no sons in the family, and the daughter simply sort of rises to prominence, kind of takes over the managing of her parents' estate, those kinds of things, and become very prominent in society and start doing this benefactor thing on their own. And in the New Testament, we get some examples of this. Lydia is probably our best example, which we might talk a little bit more about her in a minute, but Lydia is probably bankrolling some or most, perhaps, of Paul's missionary journeys. And so there were women at this time who were kind of rising to that level of benefactor. Yeah.
We can think of Lydia, and maybe more in terms of leadership, in the terms of how the church started and who was doing what. Well, from what we know from the New Testament, what roles were women playing from the get-go in terms of leadership?
Yeah, so I think let's back up just a second, because I think it's important for us, again, going back to Luke's gospel, it's important that the first people to receive the news of the resurrection are women. They're the ones who are coming to the tomb. And the reason they're coming to the tomb is a sort of female role that they were playing in society, this sort of taking care of the body, anointing the body, visiting the tomb early in the morning. This is something women would have done, women who were close to the person who had died. So they're sort of performing a female role, but then in performing that role, they are the first ones to witness the resurrection, or at least the announcement of the resurrection.
And the first ones ever to preach an Easter sermon.
That's right. And so then they're the first to go and proclaim the good news that Jesus has risen from the dead. And again, like sort of matching up the whole story of Luke, Luke begins his gospel with the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, one of the women who sometimes fades into the background, and then Mary, the announcement of the angel to Mary. And so from the jump, Luke is elevating women in his story. But if we go into Luke chapter 2, the Christmas story, as we know it famously, who's the first group that receives the good news that the king has been born? It's shepherds. It's the lowest of society. So Luke starts with this marginalized group, elevating the women, Elizabeth and Mary, and the shepherds. And he ends by telling us that the women are the first to receive the good news that Jesus has risen, and the first to then proclaim that good news. And so from the very like sort of spread of the early church, the spread of the good news about Jesus, it's women who are instigating that. And that sort of follows on from a ministry that Jesus had where there were a lot of women following him from day one. Women like Mary Magdalene, women like Mary, his mother, but we also might think of Mary and Martha. We also might think of women who are healed by Jesus, Syrophoenician woman, the woman at the well. These sort of women are probably some of those that either have contact with Jesus or become followers of him and are following him around just like the 12 male disciples are.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. And then when we get to then the early church times, we're sort of jumping ahead biblically into Paul's letters. But we see in the stories of Acts and then in the way Paul constructs his letters and sends them out, that women are playing a prominent role, sometimes in this benefactor way, sometimes in the way of being host. We have examples like Priscilla and Aquila, who are a husband and wife. They're a wife and husband, I should say. Because always, save one instance in the New Testament, they're mentioned several times. There's only one instance where Aquila's name is put first. Aquila being the husband and Priscilla being the wife. It's almost always Priscilla and Aquila. And most scholars agree that whatever's going on there, there's an intentionality of putting Priscilla's name first. And that maybe she was the first one to believe the message about Jesus. And so she was a Christian before her husband. Maybe that's why her name gets put first. Maybe her family was wealthier. She was kind of the one who had more money in the relationship. That might be why her name is first. But also some scholars have suggested that she was just a more prominent church leader, that the church, the small house church that was meeting in their home was led by Priscilla and Aquila. And perhaps it was that Priscilla and Aquila were leading in equal roles in that little house church, or maybe Priscilla was even taking more of a leadership role in that house church. Scholars have suggested all those kinds of things, but it is abnormal for the names to be transposed like that. And they are everywhere in the New Testament save one.
Okay. So you grew up in the Southern Baptist in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
I grew up in the Brethren in Edinburgh for a little bit. And they're both traditions that don't have space for women officially in church leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be called complementarian.
Yeah.
Whereas ECO and others like us would be egalitarian.
Right.
But there's also, for me, there was this weird dynamic that sure, there was the male elders who kind of made decisions, but there's always, it was the older, like probably widowed women who prayed for everything, who showed up at every meeting. They were the ones that still today send me a card, send me an email saying, Jordan, we love what you're doing in America. We miss you. I still pray for you.
Yeah.
And then, like, to me, it's like, I feel like I missed so much. Never, or not that I missed, it was confusing.
Okay.
It's that, okay, there's definitely spiritual authority that these women have.
Yes.
If marriages are in distress, those are the women that get called to pray for them. And they're the ones that are they seem to have spiritual gravitas anytime they walk into a room.
Yeah.
Or if you wanted something done, they're the people you'd go and speak to.
Yeah.
But then there was like the theological and just practical disconnect of my experience of them, or so these are people that embody what leadership should be like. But it seemed to be just the more male business credentials that got awarded with leadership roles.
Yeah. I had a similar experience growing up because the way it manifested in my church in particular, and I think often in Southern Baptist churches as a tradition, it was women, sometimes older but sometimes younger, particularly in my childhood, who were always teaching the Sunday school classes. So growing up, nearly every Bible lesson I got, probably until I was like later in high school, and then into college ministry where there was like a college minister who was always a man, who was doing the teaching. Probably for the first 13, 15 years of my life, all the Sunday school lessons I got were predominantly from women.
Right.
Which
you can't preach to like the adults, but
for
the little
sure.
formative minds of children, like feel free.
Yeah, but then even to this day, like I spend a lot of time studying the Bible. I get into the depths of it, like that's part of my role at PBA and part of the academic part of my brain. But my foundational knowledge about the Bible all came from women teaching me in Sunday school, which, as a side note, is like a sort of advertisement for Sunday school, for children's Sunday school in particular, for teaching children the Bible in all the ways that we do it. But that foundation that was laid for me was laid by women. And that has been, that was truly formative in my upbringing.
Yeah, I remember there's an older lady at the church I went to in Edinburgh who's now passed away. She died in like her mid-90s. Her name was Jean R. Her husband was Robbie R. And they were missionaries to Pakistan.
Okay.
And they drove from Edinburgh to Pakistan
No.
in 1950. So through the post-communist bloc, all the way through Central Asia and like into Pakistan.
That's
And
amazing.
they were missionaries there for 40 years. Just madness. There is a picture in our church library of them in their little car, like a Volkswagen Bug, just packed to the roof with them standing out. And you're like, that is like crazy.
Really crazy.
And I always remember like when I would first start preaching there, and whatever verse I preached on, she wouldn't look at her Bible, and she would just sit back and kind of look up to God, to the sky, and just mouth the words.
Mm.
And I'm like, I was kind of convinced that she had just learned the whole Bible off by heart
Right.
at
right.
that stage. But it was people like her where I was like, as a Christian, that's who I want to be like when I grow up.
Mm.
Like to embody that sort of, that aura, that
Yeah.
like spiritual presence.
Yeah.
So maybe can we talk a little bit about, so often complementarians who would advocate a more kind of explicit role divide,
Mm-hmm.
and they often go to the book of Romans to justify that. Can you share a little bit about, in your research about who would have presented Romans and how that was taught to the first hearers?
Yeah, and this is a great point for us to bring up because there are verses that are difficult to interpret, to exegete in Paul's writings, and there's a lot of context that goes into those. There's some in Romans, particularly some in 1 Corinthians about head coverings and women speaking up in worship gatherings in 1 Corinthians. And then there are the famous ones in 1 Timothy about the roles of elder and deacon and those being either reserved or not reserved for men only. These are actually difficult passages, and I think that's important to sort of recognize. And there are good scholars that disagree about them. But one thing that we can just see from the data of the New Testament, that we can see from just the facts of what's going on, is that a letter like Romans is written by Paul, perhaps through an amanuensis, someone who actually did the writing for him, but Paul's dictating the letter to someone who writes it down. And then Paul, this is very clear in Romans, gives it to a woman named Phoebe. And then Phoebe, who was well acquainted with the church at Rome, travels from wherever Paul was when he wrote the letter to Rome and delivers the letter to the church in Rome, whom Paul had not met. Rome is not the church in Rome is not one of the churches that Paul founds. Corinth is a church that Paul founds. Ephesus, the Ephesians, is a church that Paul founds. But Rome he had no contact with. So he uses Phoebe as a sort of go-between, and Phoebe's a woman. And she is so well acquainted with Paul and his teaching that Paul entrusts this letter, considered by scholars to be his magnum opus, to her to carry to the church in Rome. And the thing about letter carriers, we could consult Dr. Richards on this and other scholars about first century letter writing. The thing about letter carriers is that they were not only entrusted with the delivering of the letter, but they're entrusted with the first reading of the letter and probably the second reading as well. So Phoebe arrives at Rome, let's just imagine it, and she unrolls this scroll or whatever it was on, and she begins reading Romans. It's 16 chapters, but she probably read it all in one sitting. And the church in Rome is just enthralled with the words of Paul. All 16 chapters all at once. Phoebe finishes the first reading, and then the church in Rome sitting there, and they're kind of just digesting it. They're grateful that they received a letter from Paul. And then they kind of go, okay, that section in the middle where you're talking about Jews, Paul, and this is chapters 9 to 11 in Romans, you're talking about Jews, and they're either all saved or they're all not saved. What exactly did that mean?
To get circumcised again?
Yeah, are we?
What's
So wait,
going
hang on. This
Yeah.
circumcision thing. But most of us here at Gentile, was Paul clear on that? Was Paul not clear on that? Their questions are going to go to Phoebe. She's going to be the only one who can answer those questions. Maybe they can write a letter and send it back to Paul. Some churches did that. Definitely, that was a practice. But they're going to ask questions
Right.
of Phoebe because Phoebe was with Paul when he wrote
Right.
it, or at least was with him when he gave it to her. So Phoebe's got some acquaintance with what Paul was meaning, this sort of reading between the lines, the interpretation
And
of
it's
the
not
letter.
like she's a UPS worker that just knocks on the door and says, "Is this the church in Rome?
That's right.
This is from Paul."
That's
and
right.
then goes back on her merry way.
No.
It's that she's like a professor in residence.
Yeah, she's a trusted companion of Paul who has been given both the physical letter and the message of the letter to deliver to the church. And Paul labels her as a deacon at the end of Romans. He says, I entrust to you Phoebe. Please welcome her as you would welcome me. And he calls Phoebe a diakonos, a deacon. So right there, we've got at least a piece of data that says Paul considers Phoebe to be this sort of official role that was starting to float around the new churches in the New Testament. And so Phoebe gets labeled that alongside her carrying and interpreting this letter from Paul to the church in Rome.
So I think we might want to shift gears a little bit to talking about kind of the present and Memorial. So Memorial is an egalitarian church. And in my time here, it's a little around about 2 years. So that's like 104 sermons. I've heard 2 of them preached by women,
Right.
who were both married to pastors who once served here. And I think the Providencia experience would be similar.
Yeah.
That probably in the times I've been there, I've heard 3 or 4 women preach. And this is kind of an interesting one for the dynamic of 2 guys to be talking about this.
Yeah.
And that when we get an email saying, "Hey Jordan, can you come and preach?" It's like, "Yeah, I'll be there." And what sort of things can we do as pastors, and maybe as a kind of invitation to Memorial and those that are listening, and what things can we do more to like engage the female voice in these, in the pulpit and maybe in like readings, Bible studies, or whatever, and like how has it enriched your life, having engaged it in like an academic and personal level?
Yeah. I think I'd say 2 things. The first thing that I think we can do is to recognize when we hear women who clearly have the gifts of preaching and teaching. And then when we're looking for someone to fill the pulpit, they should get a call alongside you or me or whatever. That if we can recognize those gifts when we see it in women in our own congregation or even outside our congregation, and we sort of, I don't know, somehow intentionally file that in the same place that you filed Drew Melton's name or Jordan Smith's name, like put them alongside it. And I have a hard time doing that. And as part of that's because the tradition I grew up in, the Southern Baptist tradition, it just doesn't naturally happen for me. So that takes some intentionality for us to say, that woman that I heard teaching or preaching in a conference or in a just maybe a Sunday school class setting or whatever it was, she has the gift of teaching and preaching. I want to recognize that. I want to support it, and I want to lift it up. I want to elevate her voice. That takes some intentionality. That's the first thing, is just be intentional about getting more women in the pulpit. And I think a sort of side note to that, we tend to give a whole lot of men opportunities in the pulpit who maybe don't deserve opportunities in the pulpit. And I don't even have anyone who comes to mind immediately. But what I mean is we have this sort of risk calculation, which means if we say to someone, yeah, you should get up in the, oftentimes it's students, it's undergrads or maybe graduate students or whoever it is. We say, yeah, you should have an opportunity. You want to be a minister or a pastor, you should preach at our church sometime. And it's usually men. And they get up there and they might just completely bomb. And we easily chalk it up to a lack of experience. We chalk it up to whatever it is, but we're willing to take that risk. And I think when it comes to women, we're less willing to take that risk.
It's like,
and we need to be more willing to.
Yeah, in the church I grew up in Edinburgh, I was given my first opportunity to preach to the family service, like 100-something people when I was 15.
Yeah.
I got the spotty 15-year-old that knew nothing.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh yeah, have a go, Jordan.
Yeah.
And I'm like, Gene Orr is sitting in the pew, who's served 40 plus years as a missionary in Pakistan. I want to hear from her.
Mm-hmm.
But they were like, the door was like just wide open.
Yeah.
And I could kind of like stumble through and just kind of just do it without having that kind of consequence of, even if it was a total car crash, there would be another chance.
Sure.
Who are some of the voices you've read that have shaped the way you think, that really influenced you? And what would be some of the voices that we could both recommend to those that are listening? Marianne Thompson was a New Testament professor at Fuller in Pasadena, California. She had released a John commentary in 2016, I think it was. And just like a really incredible piece there. And she's also written more widely in John. And I think more contemporary voices.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody like Ruth Haley Burden, who passed away. It was the year of her. Rachel, I'm getting my names completely mixed up. Rachel Held Evans.
Ruth Haley Barton is still alive.
Yes, she is not dead. Rachel Held Evans.
Yeah.
May the 4th was the 1 year anniversary of her
Yeah.
case. And maybe a more controversial voice, really engaged in some, was like very open with the struggles of her faith. But a lot of my friends have really resonated with her voice. And
Yeah.
she seemed to speak to sort of a disenfranchised, like struggling with faith voice. But her work just resonated on such a deep level with
Yeah.
so many people.
Yeah, and she's sort of a popular level kind of writer. She's not writing academic works necessarily. A lot of her work was done in blogs and things like that. Doesn't make it any less worthy of sort of engagement and interaction. Beth Moore is another one that comes to mind on that sort of popular level, doing really good biblical work. Biblical exegesis, and really wrestling with the text of the Bible, but kind of writing then for a more popular level audience. And those are people that we should be engaging with as well. Another one that comes to my mind is a podcast, which I know probably some of our viewers are not huge podcast listeners, but some might be. The Truth's Table. TRUTH, Truth's Table, is a podcast which is 3 African American women who are dialoguing on various subjects of theology, pop culture, biblical studies, and things like that, which is a really good one.
Great.
Yeah.
And as we post this video, if you have any other voices that you like, please share them in the comments below. So Drew and I, over the kind of the next few weeks, we're still going to crank out some videos, and we're going to have a guest every week, and we're going to explore theological voices from different parts of the world. So we talk a little about the female voice, like racial voices. So we're going to have people in who have spent time in Africa, Asia, Europe, and just say, like, what are some of the theological themes that resonate in those continents that might not hear, and what are some of the things you learned spending time there. So we're going to have a variety of different voices in from all over the place. So we're excited to continue this time together, and we hope that you're staying safe and not going to stir crazy.
Good to be with you. We'll see you next week.